Oh, my favorite message.
Only for you, Ramon.
Thank you. I'm quite sure that the others cannot listen. I would just make a reminder to silence your microphones, please, as you're not talking, so we don't hear any background noise. So now we are on Facebook Live, right, Laszlo?
Yes, I'm about to start it. Just
Thank you. So maybe let's start if you want. Yeah, are we okay, Agatha, Laszlo? Shall we jump? Okay. So dear participants, welcome again to another webinar. We thanks again for being with us and for being part of this wonderful project of the Youth Peace Week. Today we will be talking a little bit about challenges, as we had already a number of challenges to human rights in these last years, but apparently the COVID pandemic has accelerated these challenges or has created new ones, but probably at the same time it has also created new opportunities for human rights. So we will be exploring all these questions with our guest speakers. I'm very happy to welcome Gregg from Oregon State University, professor and former director of peace studies. Hello, Gregg. Thanks a lot for being here in spite of the early hour in Oregon.
Thank you.
We have also with us, some of you probably already know Aggie Berecz from Pandora Association, and who is one of the co-authors of the Training Kids 13, Sustainability on Youth Work. Hello, welcome back, Aggie.
Yes, hello everyone. Good to see you.
And we also have Rory Newberry and Pegah Maysa Moulana. You already met Pegah yesterday from the Advisory Council on Youth in the Council of Europe. Thanks a lot for being here, Rory, Pegah.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Nice to join you all.
So with that in knowing who we are, I would propose that we start with our guest speakers, and I would like to give the floor to Gregg. Gregg, the floor is yours. Let's see.
Okay, let me see if I can pull up the shared screen. I want to say hello, welcome everyone. It is approximately 0700 coast of the U.S., and I am a professor at Oregon State University. Been doing this a very long time. School in my 20s, and then from in my 30s and 40s, and now in my 60s teaching at the university. We like to say that if Trump gets reelected, the west coast of the U.S. may join Canada. We're not sure what's going to happen, but when we talk about climate and human rights and certainly the pandemic, we know that the responses have been different throughout the world. Let me see if I can get my shared screen to work here. This is begin screen sharing. Is that working?
That's working.
Okay. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk about peace and activism. To tell you a little bit about myself, I've been involved in the climate change negotiations as an observer. I lead two NGO teams, the UN meetings, and my teams include young people. Some of my students have been able to go with. Two of my students, for example, were with me in Madrid this last December. Been to many, many meetings. Last week, I spent 4 days as an observer of the meeting of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And to let you know about that, I 4:30 in the morning, because every day the meeting started at European time. So 5 in the morning for me. So very involved in climate change. Another part of my life is to work at the community level, the grassroots level, with community groups and government agencies around environmental issues. So to try to provide multi-stakeholder engagement, participatory governance at the grassroots level around issues. And so that's to share conversation about that as we go along. Now, if I can get my slides to advance, we'll be in business here. That's the real challenge. So let me make sure that we're able to do that. And can you still see those slides?
We see the same one, the first one.
We see the title slide. Let me see how I get back into the. Okay, so we can advance this. Now let's see if this changes. That's what that didn't change. It's still the title slide. Let me do one thing. I'm going to stop and see if I can fix this. We had this working before. Let me try this again. This is always the challenge here. So let me try this again. Okay, now it seems to be working. You see the slide again?
No, we don't.
Oh, you don't see the show. Okay, let me try again then. Okay. I apologize for this. Here we go. Let's see if we can get this to work. Now you see the background.
Yeah, now we see the background of your computer.
But now, let's see. How about now? Did that work?
And now we see the first slide.
Okay, I think this will work. I hope so. There we go. That worked? You're on the second slide?
It's working.
Okay. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is introduce actually 4 people to you. And these are people I've had the good fortune of meeting in my life at various points in my life. And their work has certainly influenced the work that I do, both on the campus as a teacher, as a professor, and certainly in the community. And as an activist. And so I want to share those ideas with you. And as I go through this material, be thinking about how this relates to everything you've been discussing and learning this week, and certainly as well as the other presentations that we'll have this afternoon. I want to introduce you to Johan Galtung, to Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and to, at the very end, some quotes from the late Wangari Maathai. Let's meet Johan Galtung first. Some of you may know his work. I introduced his work to my students at Oregon State in the U.S. None of my students have ever heard of him, which in a way is too bad. He is a prolific peace researcher. He's written over a number of books. He's credited with founding peace studies as a discipline. He's been a professor at universities in Norway, in Croatia, and in the USA, and he's the founder of Transcend International. I had the good fortune to meet him many years ago, invite him to my campus as a peace lecturer, and have not seen him in a number of years, but when I was attending peace studies conferences, Professor Galtung was often there, and we had a chance to chat. What's interesting about his work is that he's been very innovative in the nature of peace. And what is he known for? Well, he's known in part for his distinction between negative peace and positive peace. When I show you these slides, I'm not going to read every single sentence. Provide these slides for you, and I've sent them to Ramon to share with you, and so you can go through the detail, but I'll highlight the material that is on these slides. Negative peace, Galtung writes, refers to the absence of violence, and a good example, if there is a military confrontation and the parties declare a ceasefire, that would be an example of something that refers to the absence of violence, to stop the violence. But positive peace stems from constructive activity such as building relationships, creating social systems that serve the needs of a community or society, and the constructive resolution of conflict. So you can see the difference. It's almost like saying the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. Positive peace is very optimistic, believing that we can develop systems of peace, and of course that's critical to human rights. Some other points that come from Galtung that has certainly influenced my work. He writes really that peace is, and this is my interpretation to be fair, I've adapted these ideas from the work of Galtung, that peace is the confrontation and elimination of violence in all forms, and that violence is anything that denies people the opportunity to realize their potential, psychological and physical potential. And we can think about, certainly all over the world, whenever we see human rights violations, if you will, or human rights compromised, when that occurs, the opportunities for people to realize their potential is taken away or is limited. In my country, in the U.S., we've invested certainly in public education, as have many countries in the world. What's behind that? Well, part of the thinking behind public education, free public education, is that through education, people can pursue opportunities to realize their potential as human beings. Positive peace and peace building involve creating and improving all types of systems, institutional, relational, that foster sustainable peace and minimize violence. And so positive peace as peace building will respect basic human needs, such as survival, physical well-being, liberty, and identity. And again, I've adapted that from a number of writings of Johann Galtung. One of the things that I really found provocative when I first read his work, which was back in the 1980s, when I, in fact, was studying conflict resolution in graduate school and later became peace studies director at Oregon State, is the distinction that he makes between direct and structural violence, and then later he added the concept of cultural violence. When he talked on our campus years ago, he talked about these kinds of violence, and he's written extensively about them. And he notes that direct violence is the way many people simply think about violence. One party suffers harm because of the actions of another. We can identify the agent of violence. Of course, in some countries, we have, like the U.S., we have big prison systems. We incarcerate people, put them in jail, if you will, because they've harmed someone else. Structural violence is different. One party suffers harm because actions not attributable to another party. We can identify the victims, but it's hard to pinpoint the agent of violence. Who's doing the violence on people? And structural violence is often indirect, appearing as exploitation and repression. And you might think of examples, certainly, of structural violence, and sometimes people refer to this as institutional violence. What's been happening around the world, and certainly in my country, in the U.S., in terms of systemic racism, really relates directly to structural violence. And then in more recent years, Professor Galtung has talked about and written about cultural violence, and this is where one party suffers harm because of the self-perceived superiority of another, a kind of ethnocentrism, or a term he used in a talk I heard him give years ago was chosen peopleness. And Galtung writes that aspects of culture can, in fact, be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. When he gave his talk on campus, he used as an example of cultural violence missionary work. And he said missionaries may have good intentions, but when they go into a community and expect that community to change to the ways of the missionaries, they may be, in fact, engaging in a kind of cultural violence. So we can, again, think about how all of these forms of violence can impact, certainly, human rights. I want to change, though, from Johann Galtung to have you meet Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. And to be fair, I never have met Dolores Huerta. I met Cesar Chavez when I was, in fact, 20 years old, back in the early 1970s, so quite some time ago. And this goes back to the 1960s and 1970s, and it might be an era that your parents or grandparents are aware of, because it wasn't unique to the U.S., but this was a particular issue in the United States at that time, because for decades in the United States, farm workers were exploited, people who worked in agriculture, picking fruit, for example, taking care of crops. They were doing difficult work for long hours. The working conditions were poor. They weren't protected against the use of chemicals. They didn't really have any benefits, and they weren't paid very well. In the 1960s, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez founded the United Farm Workers Union, a labor and civil rights organization, and the UFW conducted produce boycotts, for example, grapes and lettuce in the 1960s and 1970s. I went to work for the United Farm Workers as a 20-year-old in the state of Minnesota, and had the good fortune to meet Cesar Chavez when he came to Minnesota to help us organize local boycotts against grapes and lettuce. And in fact, my aunt called me a communist for doing so, and I got called a communist while standing in front of markets, handing out leaflets urging people to not buy grapes or lettuce unless they had a union label on them. And I found the work of Cesar Chavez and later Dolores Huerta inspirational, in part because of their commitment to human rights, to civil rights, and to nonviolent action. What I've included in this talk are some things about Huerta and Chavez. As I mentioned, they were inspirational. They took great risks. They confronted direct structural and cultural violence. They believed in practicing nonviolence and civil disobedience, and they sought labor rights, and not only labor rights, but family rights. For example, at the time, children were working in the fields alongside their parents instead of going to school. What I've included here are some quotes of note from Huerta and Chavez. While Professor Galtung is an academic, obviously Huerta and Chavez were not academics, they were activists, and some of the more admirable activists that I've gotten to know in my lifetime. And so you can read these quotes as you have time. I like this first one: every moment is an organized opportunity. Every person is a potential activist. Every minute a chance to change the world. And if we go down to Cesar Chavez, I also like preservation of one's own culture does not require contempt or disrespect for other cultures. And you can see in their quotes, and they've said many things that have been quoted in lots of writings, lots of talks. I wanted to share a few with you. Well, what does this all lead to in terms of the climate crisis, certainly the health crisis, and what we might call a human rights crisis? I've been actively engaged in climate issues for a number of years, and we don't need to revisit the climate science. That consensus is very strong, but the controversy comes over climate policies and what actions need to be taken, and some ideas that I'd like to share with you, and I'd like you to encourage you to think of your own. Recognize certainly structural violence in the climate crisis, for example, ways in which indigenous people have been marginalized. We can also think about the importance of organizing to educate, advocate, and influence. And we think about Fridays for the Future, which really came out of Greta Thunberg's activism in front of Parliament in Sweden. And we know that story. And of course, we can all support organizations and politicians that endorse or support a green climate agenda. And that's really anywhere, certainly in the world. When we think about the health crisis in terms of peace, we know that the pandemic's impacts reflect structural violence with impacts on communities of color or low income. And we know that the health and well-being are affected. Here in the United States, sadly, the people who are coming down with the pandemic are disproportionately people of color and people from low income groups. And in terms of peace, we know that overcoming the pandemic relies in part civility and civic responsibility, where we really understand that we are interconnected and interdependent, and we need to care about one another. And that means that my students need to care about me as an old professor. And as we come back to campus, perhaps in September, to make sure that we continue to respect the health needs of everyone. In terms of activism, you and I can advocate and educate for responsible behaviors from individuals. We can ask more of our governments, and some examples include, of course, social responsible behavior, masks and distancing, and actions to support people in need. I've worked over the years with a good friend of mine at the University of Copenhagen, and I've had the good fortune to teach there from time to time. We were on the phone just the other day comparing how Denmark and the U.S. have responded to the pandemic. And quite frankly, what Denmark has done, from my perspective, is of housing, of jobs, of healthcare, so that people, as this pandemic continues, aren't put into very difficult situations where they can't, in fact, realize their potential as people. And what about human rights? Well, I don't want to belabor this because this is an area that you all know well. You've been focusing on that throughout this week. This is simply what comes from the United Nations statement on human rights, and you can read that and you can say, well, what's missing from this? I think we could rewrite this perhaps to reflect more what the world is now in 2020. But the real point here is that everyone's entitled to what we would define as fundamental human rights without discrimination. But I would encourage you, as you look at a statement like this from the UN, to think what you would add to it and what, again, the implications are for peace and activism. So some questions that we might consider in our conversation later, we might ask ourselves, what forms of violence threaten human rights? In what ways, and is one form of violence the most significant to address? And I'll give you a hint. Galtung would say yes, and you could probably guess which one he says is most important to address. What human rights strategies are important for confronting violence and providing opportunities to realize their potential? And then what's the nature of activism relative to human rights, and what role does activism play in achieving human rights? And then are human rights best addressed at the grassroots level or by governments and organizations, or both? And if so, what's the relationship between grassroots efforts and efforts at a more institutional level? The crisis of climate, health, and human rights, I think there are connections here, and I put a list together, and this is a very limited list. Well, which of these climate crisis issues relate to human rights and to public health? And you might look at this and say all of them do, or some of them do, or you might add to that. One that I want to focus on in particular is the concept of just transition, which has become an important concept in the UN climate change negotiations in the last few years. And just transition recognizes that as we hopefully transition to a carbon-free economy, a carbon-free society, a carbon-free environment, if you will, that people will be affected, people whose jobs have been tied to the way we've done things in the past. And we need to certainly help people and communities make a transition that is fair, that is just. And so there's become a link between climate justice and this concept of just transition, which I think is important because everyone is entitled to fundamental human rights. Now, I also think we need to examine the connections between peace and activism. And in doing so, I'd encourage us to think holistically and systemically. Climate crisis is about human rights, and human rights embrace health. They're all elevated through activism. So what do we need to do? We need to look for opportunities to intervene, to act to change the system and foster positive peace. And I have faith in younger generations. I'm asked by my friends of my generation, the baby boomer generation, if I'm hopeful about the future, and I say I certainly am, in part because in my conversations with my students, they really want to change the systems in positive ways, whether it's related, again, to pandemics or certainly to climate change and to other issues that, of course, are so important to developing a healthy, sustainable society that provides people with the opportunity to realize their potential. Well, lastly, I want to close with some thoughts from environmental and peace activist Wangari Maathai. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, first woman to earn a PhD from an East African country. I had the good fortune to meet her in Copenhagen at one of the climate change conferences, actually got to have lunch with her, and I found her work to be inspirational. She started a tree planting program in Kenya, and you can read her quotes again, that human rights are not things that are put on the table for people to enjoy. They're things that we need to fight for and protect. And of course, is her next quote, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, and that time is now. And her last quote, which I love, when we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and the seeds of hope. So in this short talk, I wanted to introduce you to a theorist, Johan Galtung, to activists, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and Wangari Maathai, who was everything. She was in part academic, in part politician, and in part activist. And it's from people like Dr. Maathai and certainly Ms. Huerta, Mr. Chavez, and Professor Galtung that we can learn and we can be inspired, just as we can learn from and be inspired by our peers, by our colleagues. And with that, I thank you for your time in listening and look forward to the other presentations and the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Gregg, for this lingering and this making links both between people who may be different, but who are working at from different points of view, and also for these links that you made between different concepts such as peace, activism, environment, human rights. But on a personal note, I would say thanks for your optimism and for your positive note on the future. Let's see how we can discuss all this in the dialogue we will have. I would like to give the floor to Aggie now, that probably some of you already met this morning in the workshop on youth work and sustainability. Aggie, thanks a lot for being here again. The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. So I met some of you in the morning, and then I talked to Ramon, and I was really questioning, so what is the best way I can contribute this with? So I didn't prepare a presentation. Maybe I'll just say a few things about what I'm doing, and I was taking notes, and there is one specific field I'm very interested in. So about my background, I have been working in this field of sustainability, let's say, or maybe we find a better word, in the last maybe 15 years. And first establishing a program for children, an out-of-school environmental education program, and then being involved with the Erasmus Plus program, which was then by the European Council, which was then called Youth Program and then Youth in Action. And as a trainer and a youth worker, mainly working on projects related to ecology, sustainability, and our place in the ecosystem, really. Like, I'm very much interested in humans as part of nature, and kind of raising that awareness that talking about environmental protection is a kind of alienating, so separating us from really accepting and knowing and living that we are nature and we are part of it. So that was a little bit of the topic of this workshop, and let's see if I can screen share. Just to introduce you to the project that I wanted to bring in as an example. Oh yeah, so this first, I think I was mainly invited because of this publication that has been planned for a long time, because T-Kits are these European publications that help youth workers and adult educators to work on specific issues. So there is one that was published maybe last year, if I remember well, or 2018, that is to look at the relation of youth work and sustainability, and also giving concrete examples of activities that if you work with groups, you can use as a guidance or just use as an inspiration. And as I said, I'm very interested in this field of human and our place. And now there is this project that I've been coordinating. It's an international project called Inner Pathways to Sustainability. So we look at, since September 2018, 6 countries from Europe, and we work on non-formal, it's a little bit like a toolkit like this, non-formal educational tools. Some of them are online, so if you're interested, you can go on there, podcast and the book and the training curriculum, and really looking at the intersection of inner work and outer work. So where does this shift happen in a person who starts to live, we said, mindfully on the planet? So living mindfully in a sense of really being mindful about my role, my connection with others, and the effects of my life. And we did just finished a learning journey, which is another way of saying a training, which was meant to be a residential training for 26 people from these 6 countries. And it ended up an online course with some really unexpected methods, like through Zoom and doing as interactive as we could. Really looking at the different practices that can nourish us as persons to sustain our intention and sustain our energy levels. So these are regenerative practices Pacific practices from the field of meditation, mindfulness, or embodiment that are raising awareness of our interconnectedness with nature. And also like looking at community practices, different ways of communication. One of them is just going back here, you can find the newest podcast that we produced about the way of council, that is an ancient tradition that now is awakened by many people across the world, using this traditional way of sitting on the ground, but sitting in circle and bringing our focus from our head to our hearts, to really share stories with each other. Yeah, so it's just finished, and actually we just finished like an hour ago, the last meeting. And I now open a few slides from the presentation I prepared for this morning. And just going to this. So these are slides where I put pictures from social media that some of you might have come across. And I guess this is going to be the focus of this discussion. So what is the relation between COVID-19 pandemic and climate change? I have this picture that I find really insightful. And yeah, since March, I think this debate has been on about is it really a shift? Is it really a global turning point? Is it really some form of breaking through of the idea that we need a different global economical political system? Is it something like an awakening sign to us? And is it a turning point of a real change to happen? I guess this is the big question. And I prepared a slide that I'm not sure. Yes, maybe just going back to this one. And as I was listening to Gregg, and also from our conversation with Ramon, I started to think like, oh yes, and then this morning we had an interesting sharing on how the pandemic made our lives more sustainable in terms of ecological sustainability and also in terms of personal sustainability. And I heard some really inspiring things from you. And then I reflected on yes, how was it more sustainable for this residential training that we at the end did online? Obviously, we cut off a lot of the carbon emission of, traveling and flying. And there was this other question of like, yes, and we didn't meet personally. Therefore, we had to really put a lot of work into focusing on screens and connecting this way. And that's a really interesting point of this communication, like we are doing it now, and like Youth Peace Week also went online. So I started to think what we value more as a consequence of the pandemic, which I think maybe it's a starting point on looking at, is it really a turning point? Is it really that moment of shift? So yeah, just a few ideas that I collected from people today, and yeah, reflecting on this past few months. I think we really value presence, like real presence now, and also online presence. And we might value the local connections a lot more. And during lockdown, I have many friends being stuck in city flats. And I guess it's very clear that we value nature a lot more. And we value teachers, if you have kids, or if you happen to have friends who have kids, or if you're a grandfather, you know how hard work it was for parents in the past few months to replace the school system in many ways. So we definitely value teachers and healthcare workers. I don't know if you have this putting little hearts in your windows in your country? Is it a global thing or is it just in Hungary? That's a sign of solidarity with healthcare workers. So I guess there are many things we value a lot more since the pandemic broke out. And I would be very interested if there was a floor for this to ask you what you value more. And maybe just one thought that I thought, it's coming back again and again. And I think I first heard it from Chase Eisenstein, who did a really interesting recording and essay called The Coronization, but it was still back in April or May, about the effects of the pandemic. And it brings my attention to this realization, like acceptance of uncertainty, because I feel like this was a really aha moment of realizing, like, yes, we can plan things. We can plan an offline residential international event, but then it can anytime happen to be differently. And so maybe, yeah, with the pandemic, it's more kind of accepted now that basically we live in an uncertain world. And I think there is a lot of respect that is involved with that. So I will stop here, just my thoughts. And I would really love to hear at some point what you guys value more as a result of the pandemic. I stop sharing and give the word back to Ramon.
Thanks a lot, Aggie. Thanks for the sharing, and I think that there will be one question that would come, and it's even if the project that you were mentioning is finished just 1 hour ago, and I see the link in the chat on ways to share and to get involved as well in this movement. That's a question that I guess that could come during the question and answer. With this, I would like to thank you and to give the floor to our final presentation to Rory and Pegah from the Advisory Council on Youth. The floor is yours, Pegah, Rory.
Thank you, Raymond. Hi, everyone. My name is Pegah, and I think some of you have seen me yesterday. I'm from Advisory Council on Youth, and at the moment I am the portfolio holder on climate governance within the youth department. So let's say the whole topic is a big baby of mine, since I'm also academic on the topic. So I will briefly go through a PowerPoint with you, and then I'll give the remaining time to Rory, who is the portfolio holder on youth, peace and security. So let's see if it works. Yes. Okay, so for me, I want to take this time to sort of talk to you about right to a healthy environment. Is there a connection between human rights, climate change, and security? So first question I want you to ask yourself is that, do we have an entitlement to have a healthy environment? And as a lawyer, we always say yes, but it depends. And what that tends to say is that no article within the international human rights law specifies that we have a right or entitlement to human rights. And I think the Committee for Economic and Social Rights summarizes that very well. And it says that everyone has the right to an adequate environment, and it's considered as a precondition to realization of other human rights. And that sort of puts us in advantage, because then that means environment is included in every aspect of our life. But at the same time, there's also a fragility of sensing that, does that mean that right to environment comes as a plus and not as an overarching system? And that's something that we need to consider when we talk about security. When it comes to Council of Europe also takes a similar approach and applies European Convention of Human Rights on different articles. So there are they applied and see right to environment as a right to life. They see it as a right to protect your property, because again, natural resources has that notion of connection with a property or common property for all of the members of society. There are also right to respect for private and family life, because and this is mainly being done with the respect of whether pollution is impacting people's current lifestyle, and whether states are obliged to take positive obligations. There is also a right to protect for health, since we are very much dependent on the nature of environment and also our lifestyle. And lastly, freedom of expression. If we are unhappy with the way that state is treating the environment, do we have right to protest against it? And we've seen that within youth movement a lot, in the sense that they are taking positive actions and voicing their concerns. So, what is the definition of environmental security? So, environmental security tends to come forward when there is a consequence of environmental exhaustion. And it tends to be very much environmental resource and pollution centered. And it is led by the biodiversity loss, climate change, contamination of water and food in order to be putting yourself in an advantage during an armed conflict. And what is important here is that environmental security is an important element of peace and security establishment, because humans are dependent towards the environment, and it can be used as a weapon to render local communities away from their community. What you need to also notice is that cause and consequences of conflicts arising by environment are very much similar to a typical armed conflict. So a lot of causes to exhaustion of environment during armed conflicts is due to poverty, militarization, and also destruction of the environment when there is an armed conflict. There is the corruption, as you might have been following in a lot of countries. They are selling, for instance, timber to other countries to resource the conflict, and ISIS is doing that pretty much a lot in Iraq with the use of oil. There is also inequality, and due to that, there is this idea of oppression. But one thing we also tend to forget is that natural resources are a big fuel when it comes to peace and security. Regardless of us making that connection to the environment, natural resources is what keeps the conflict going. And natural resource governance is what actually provides us a sustainable peace. But also, victims of environmental security is very much similar to a typical armed conflict. We have young people, we have women, and especially minority groups who have been pushed away from the community in order to provide those resources for military use. So what is the nexus between security and environment? There is the sense of forced migration, as we now call it, climate refugees, which its status is still indecisive. Even though there's plenty of academic research showing that climate refugees are happening as we speak, and it's only going to get worse, which gives us a perspective within Council of Europe that we need to adapt and provide a more definition when it comes to forced migration. Environmental exhaustion also provides unstable democracy, as sometimes states might go into a peace, but due to the way that they are treating the environment and natural resources, they end up going back to a conflict zone. And again, that means that we need to have a better governance over environment. This also includes lack of access to justice due to the lack of neutral courts and tribunals. And unfortunately, something I hate to say, it's environmental security is always about survival of the fittest. And that tends to be similar when it comes to when we look at armed conflicts. But it might be good to start by saying that what has been done on a Council of Europe basis. I'm not going to go through this presentation, but you can read it for yourself. And what you can see here is that there has never been a direct correlation between environmental security. They have looked at environment specifically. They've looked at it as a human rights. They've looked at climate change very briefly, but they have never put young people, security, and environment on one document. So that's something that Council of Europe needs to work way more better. And I think that's something that the Youth Department of Council of Europe is trying to take. So how is Advisory Council, meaning myself and Rory, working on this topic? At the moment, we are working on the implementation of UN Resolution 2250 into the idea of environmental security. We also are working on guidelines on how youth engagement can contribute to working in this connection of nexus between environment and security. And we are now working on gathering information on how to support environmental efforts and youth peace builders such as yourself. So we are very much on a gathering information basis and also working on codifying those into a practice that later can be used. But what can you do about it as peace builders? Well, first, you need to open the debate. We sometimes take that for granted and we give that to youth organizations who are working on environment to do the talk for us. But you are the experts on peace building, and we need to know what exactly is happening on the ground level when it comes to the environmental infringements. So we need to have that dialogue a bit more. And please help us in gathering the information, where the situation is most prevalent, and also the statistical causes of this. And lastly, implement Resolution 2250 in light of environmental security, because that element tends to be taken for granted. And that's it from me. Hopefully I didn't eat a lot of your time, Rory. Now the floor is yours.
Sorry, I can forgive you. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to join you, and I'm also just really happy that you can all meet online, and of course that we can meet with you. So I'm a portfolio lead on youth peace and security at the Advisory Council on Youth, and I joined in March, and I really wasn't expecting to be focusing a lot of our time on this global pandemic, but here we are. So it's definitely a huge obstacle to achieving youth peace and security across Europe and, of course, around the world, as if there weren't enough obstacles before, of course. It's worth noting, and I think repeating, that human rights violations, and I quite like Gregg mentioned earlier, human rights compromises. So we're not necessarily violating it. There's a constant juggle between the necessities that we face and also respecting and adhering to human rights. And I think the reason I'd really like to talk about this, and I think the reason why it's such an interesting debate, if not quite a depressing one, is that, you know, I found myself over the past few months thinking about the human rights that we all take for granted, or many of us can take for granted, such as freedom of movement. And over the past few months, I've been saying, well, actually, people shouldn't be able to move freely. And I'm already sort of deciding for other people that they shouldn't have the human right to free movement. So I think it's probably not wrong that you sort of have these discussions, and that it's, you know, you discuss the greater good. Maybe we shouldn't let people move around as much as possible so that we can contain a virus. But then the issue, or one of the real issues, or a whole other host of issues, come when we start normalizing those discussions, and when we start taking those discussions for granted and actually saying, well, you know, there shouldn't be freedom of movement, and that discussion sort of peters away, and 2 years later we don't have freedom of movement anymore. So I think that's a really interesting, well, you know, the fact that I'm here sort of advocating for human rights, but also advocating for other people's human rights to be removed so that we can survive a pandemic is really worrying, actually. But good that it's a discussion. I think we should keep that discussion going. And as time goes by, I think it's really on all of us to make sure that we are carrying on having those discussions, making sure that we don't make statements like nobody should have freedom of movement and sort of move on to the next discussion, that we really discuss these things and make sure that there are implications, or there is a huge situation when we start making big statements like this and taking them for granted. The other issue, of course, and especially as young people in Europe and worldwide, is that these discussions and sort of the removal of our human rights over the past few months because of the pandemic aren't happening as a public debate. The nature of the pandemic means that decisions need to be taken swiftly, and they need to be taken, you know, as quickly as possible so that people are as safe as possible, such as freedom of movement. And these kind of discussions in the UK have been discussions that have been going on for decades, whether we should have freedom of movement, or EU citizens should have freedom of movement in the UK. And overnight we had to, well, not overnight, and we didn't have to, but over a series of weeks, and the government decided that we should, stop people coming into the UK, and when they come, they should be quarantined. And these are huge human rights issues that we should be talking about. And that's just one of the human rights issues that we face. And of course, adding to the list of human rights violations or compromises that we've had for the past decades, and if not longer than decades, before we had the Human Rights Convention. So I think also, you know, one thing we can all do is have those discussions. The other thing we can do is make sure we're having those discussions with as many people as possible. We also need to make sure that we're considering other people. I think our tendency is to talk about the our rights that are being violated, and to sort of be very selfish about it, which we absolutely should, because we should have these rights and they should be respected. But we also all need to be very aware that other people's rights are being violated, possibly more than ours, and that it will have a greater impact on other people as we go forward. And I think we talk about the pandemic and the health crisis and the public health crisis that we face, but this will be followed quite swiftly, and we're already seeing it, by an economic crisis. And quite luckily, we've already seen quite luckily, not at all quite luckily, but we have already seen an economic crisis over the past decade. So we know what it looks like. We know the rights that are violated when decisions are taken by governments to not provide certain services, or to prioritize other services to cut costs, and also to become more efficient or streamline government finances. We know what those arguments look like. They generally don't respect human rights. We're generally not invited to be part of those discussions. So it's really important, while we're sort of at the beginning of this economic crisis that follows the health and the humanitarian crisis, that we proactively put ourselves in those positions of challenging people, making sure that those people working in institutions and parliaments, and those that are claiming to represent us, really are listening to the needs to respect human rights, and to make sure that it's not just normalized that we take away people's human rights for the sake of combating a virus. And also really important that we're having those discussions locally and with institutions, and internationally as well, because we can learn a lot from others. I think one of the things we try to do as an advisory council, luckily we come from a very quite a wide background of different countries and types of organizations from around Europe, so we can have those discussions with us, but we need to make sure that they're happening outwards, and that we involve people that may not be thinking about young people and their rights. They may not be thinking about minority groups and people from minority backgrounds and their rights. So we need to be putting those at the front of the agenda and looking out for other people as well. I think the last thing I'll point on is that there are many people working in institutions that would probably quite happily have these discussions, and quite happily put those issues of human rights violations to their counterparts, and put those into sort of the policy making and lawmaking processes. It's really important that I think you reach out to, if you're in the EU, reach out to the European Union, reach out to your local governments, your national governments, and try and find those people that really are interested in these issues. If you have a local representative or a parliamentarian that is leans towards social justice rather than social injustice, then reach out to them, give them your support, because very often these things we have these conversations within our groups and forget that there are people in different spheres that actually are interested in promoting these ideas. So that's all I'll say. And if anybody's interested in working with the Council of Europe or the Advisory Council on this, please do reach out. As a portfolio, we're really, really interested in hearing how COVID-19 is affecting your rights, and the work that you do, or the work you may do with young people across Europe. And of course, I just say reach out to anybody as possible. Try and make some noise. Campaign if you're leaning towards the campaign route, and just make sure that we keep talking about these things, because I really don't want to be in a situation in a few years' times where the pandemic's possibly eased down, but we're still in a situation where governments aren't really respecting people's rights and still using COVID-19 as an excuse to violate people's rights. So once again, thank you very much for having us. It's always a good opportunity to speak to everybody. And of course, if you have any questions, do let us know.
Thanks a lot, Rory, Pegah, and especially thanks for letting us know what we can do. So we don't stay on how in how bad situation is the world now, but on we focus the debate on what we can do, and on the fact that we can do things. I guess that one of the questions that may come at one point, because I'm seeing it in the chat, is how can we contact you, especially you, but also the Advisory Council, for information on this. With this, my proposal would be to open the floor for discussion. As I know that you are very active, you have been very active during all these days, and it's not something we need to worry whether there's going to be questions or not. It's just that Pegah is thanks a lot, Pegah. Pegah is sharing with us in the chat a survey to gather information on how COVID-19 is impacting youth organizations. Thanks a lot for sharing this. And I would propose you, as we do in other meetings, if you want to ask a question, please write your name in the chat, and I will give you the floor, as I think it's much better if you can ask the question yourself. Aggie, at one point at the beginning, was was asking if it would be possible to see as much of you as it's possible in video, because this can make interaction a little bit easier. So I encourage you as well to put your video on if you have some questions. For the moment, I don't see questions appearing. Yeah, I see Mariami now.
But also Özden had a question a bit up there.
Okay. Okay, maybe let's start with Mariami as we look for the other question. So, Mariami, do you want to ask, or you cannot ask?
Yeah. Okay, I will ask directly. Yes, thank you for all the presenters. It was very interesting topic you were talking about. Just I'm interested in specifically, how do you think, in which ways COVID-19 affects, especially on women rights? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mariami. Are you directing this question to someone specifically, or just to the panel in general?
Just to the panel in general.
Okay.
For me, yeah, it's okay.
I think Pegah wants to answer. I'm seeing you. Yes, Pegah?
Thank you, Ramon, and thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question, and the main problem we've had with COVID-19 is the fact that lockdown and how it's impacting young women when it comes to this safety and security back home. There has been a huge boost of increase of domestic violence towards young women, and simply they have not managed to reach, let's say, safety because they would have to be in a lockdown anyway. And they've rarely accessed support from local authorities simply because they are also unable to do anything because of the lockdown. What do you do? Where to go? And that boost of incidents has really reflected to us that we thought we've tackled the problem, but it's clearly not the case. And that reflection is something that we need to do something about, not only because there's a COVID-19, but because that conversation seems to have not worked. And I think when it comes to the safety of women, we are far more behind than we thought. And I think that's something personally that we need to do more. We have a gender rapporteur who is specifically focusing on that. So with that concern, we are hoping to hopefully have that conversation continue. If there's anything to add, Rory, please do let me know.
Thanks a lot, Rory, Aggie, Gregg. I don't know if you want to add up
Aggie,
something.
If you wanna. I can go. If I was waiting for Aggie to go.
Yeah, you can go, Rory.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely echo what Pegah said. I mean, when we consider domestic abuse already being disproportionately leaning towards women being the victims of domestic abuse, the system's already not being in place before lockdown to protect many women from domestic abuse. Reporting, so the right to legal protection, for example, for women who are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse and other forms of abuse, not necessarily domestic. That was before lockdown, and we go into a situation where we're all trapped in our homes and with even less access to legal support, to protection. It only gets worse, and there have been great initiatives to make sure that the message is out there in the UK, for example, to make sure that if you do need help, there are sort of subtle ways that you can get the messaging out there, but still not enough, and still doesn't solve the institutional problems the institutional barriers to actually seeking protection, seeking justice. So a long way to go, and as with many things and many human rights violations, COVID-19 only sort of extended those issues and made them worse. So please, Aggie, sorry to cut you off there.
No, you didn't. And yeah, actually, I just one thing to contribute to, because it's not specifically human rights, but it's more just to mention the situation of mothers. And I don't know if it's like affecting any of you, So I'm a mother of 2 young child, and I'm also the coordinator of an other international project called Mother Nature, where we support mothers in the first years of motherhood with a card deck, a nature-based course, and a guidebook. And it's about really focusing on how we are doing as mothers and how we are developing and how hard is this inner work as well. So throughout the whole lockdown, we opened an online club. We called it Mother Club, because we felt with these other 2 colleagues that women are now really in the situation of holding the space for the whole family, plus not being able to work from home because they are with kids, and also having to replace teachers, basically. So like doing 3 or 4 full-time jobs at the same time. And I just experienced that most of the mothers really needed help, and what we could offer was the support of the community, of an online community. So we just shared every week about something like a different focus. It could be education, or sometimes it was connection to nature. So it's a different side of this, but really, yeah, like looking at all this on social media, people saying like how cool is that they don't have to go anywhere, so they can do a lot of online courses. That was totally upside down for mothers. So yes, they were stuck online because of, like mentoring their children, but really like having trouble finding any time for themselves. Maybe
Thanks a lot for sharing, Aggie. I have to say that I feel very empathetic with you on this, as it also happened to me to go through the same situation, even as a single dad at some point. So thanks a lot for sharing, and I feel very empathetic. I don't know, Gregg, if you want to add up something on this, or I would, as I have another question by Julia. Gregg?
Go ahead to the next question. I thought the answers from my colleagues were very appropriate, and I endorse them.
Okay, Julia, the floor is yours.
I think Pegah wanted to say something. I saw her raising the hand.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Go, Julia.
So I wanted to follow with a comment when Aggie was talking about the effects of COVID and the lockdown to environment. And actually, during these last 3 months, I had the reflection with myself, like seeing all the people around me. I don't know if you saw it in the news, but basically Barcelona, in the last 3 months, the air pollution levels went down to before the First World War, more or less, or during the First World War. And 2-3 days after the lockdown was done, let's say, the levels of the air pollution went just right back to before the lockdown. And it took me some days to like see what was going on in my environment, friends, family, people that I know and I have in my social media. And I was seeing all this motivation of going back to their normal life, and I just had this like confrontation inside myself, like is this lockdown really doing something, like a change between the normality before the lockdown and after the lockdown? Because I was seeing all these people that they were just excited, like, oh, I need to see my friends, I need to go back to the bars, I need to go to the beach, I need to do all these trips. And I was feeling like this lockdown, instead of making a change, it was just like making people react like, oh, now I need to do all these things that I wasn't able to do during these 3 months. And it was actually like, have we kind of forgot that climate change is still here, or that we still need to protect the environment? And also all these things about like my trips in Easter, like I was planning to do this trip in Easter to go here and to go there and go to this fancy place, and then suddenly people is already like, oh, I need to do this Easter plan again. And you just, I don't know, I was having this massive feeling of like, not anxiety, but I was kind of confused of if we are all actually learning something, or these 3 months of lockdown were just like a kind of break, and then now we have to do everything that we haven't done. And connecting with human rights, I felt like there was also a lot of people having this like selfish reaction of, maybe we were actually talking about freedom of movement and I don't know, everything. But I felt like we had this, let's say, European dream that everything is going well and everything is going fine and we're all protected. But then actually we were complaining about the lockdowns. We cannot get out of home because we have to protect elder people and people that have like more risk of us than us to get the virus. But then Palestine has been in a lockdown for 14 years, like the West Bank has been in a lockdown for 14 years. And then all these people going to supermarkets like crazy, like there was no toilet paper anywhere. And in Yemen in 2018, they had a lot of real problems because they weren't able to get food to their supermarkets. And it's just like, I was getting this feeling of, we are reacting in a way that it's not really responsible, and we are appealing to the human rights when it's actually our fault. Like, I don't know if I'm explaining myself properly, but it's just like a comment that then if you want
Thanks a lot, Julia.
add something.
Let me give the floor to the panelists because I see that the chat is starting to get many comments. Okay. Are we learning something from this crisis? I mean, is this really a turning point? If I can make the point to your comment. I don't know, Gregg, if you would like to start answering.
Julia, I appreciate very much what you've described. As I listen to you, I think about the anxiety the situation brought on all of us, and my friends and I have discussed climate change, and is that now less important than the pandemic? I have no doubt we will get through this, but I think part of the frustration is we don't know when it will end. So if there's a typhoon or a hurricane, it's a tragedy. It's a catastrophic event, and we can do that with a heat wave or with a cold wave. We know it will end. And in the case of the pandemic, we don't know when it will end. It's a new experience for everyone around the world. Everyone is, and people become impatient and they want to get back to the old normal. And I think it was in one of the cartoons, the new normal. We don't know what that's going to be. What I hope, and I see this in my students, before the pandemic, I would talk to my students about climate change. Some of my 21-year-olds, 20-year-olds would say they never want to have children. The world is too bad. It's just, they can't do it. Climate change is changing our lives. And I would say, don't take that attitude. We will get through this. It will get better. When I was 20 and 21, I thought I'd never have terrible. And we were in the U.S. and the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons all over. I have 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. So obviously, I think it's where the relationships we have are so important, because it's in the relationships that we can find support, we can find empathy. But the anxiety that I heard you talk about, I think many people share, and that's why we, as alone as we might feel at times because of home, we want to reach out to people. I make more phone calls to family members now than I did before, in part to make that connection. I make it to old colleagues, people I went to graduate school with, even high school, 40 some years ago. So I think your comments are very important, and we have to be able to do that. Now, I will say there's a silver lining in this, and that is that we see the relationships between health and climate change. We see the relationships between structural racism, health, and climate change. And it may be in that people better address the complexity and the connections, recognize that we can't solve one problem or tackle one problem in isolation from others. I appreciate very much the comments that you've made.
Thanks, Gregg. Pegah, Rory, Aggie. Is there any? Yeah, Pegah, I see you.
I'll briefly contribute as well, because I was, let's say I've been following the statistics on the impact of COVID-19 towards environment. And I remember when the first month of COVID hit, like China went completely, like drastically different to its pollution rate. But then as soon as it got opened up a bit, it went high up again. And what that makes me think, and I'm looking at, the way that UK suddenly opened, access to beaches, and then suddenly people went and trashed the whole place, and that has helped me to reflect, to say that it's not that we don't understand there is climate change, it's that we are living in the wrong lifestyle. It's that regardless of there being a pandemic or not, yes, the Earth took a bit of a break whilst we were in isolation, and that was a great thing. But as soon as we go back, it will go back to normal. And as a result, as policymakers, as activists, we need to be working endlessly to change that attitude of lifestyle. To say that, this is not okay. You cannot pollute that much. You cannot trash everywhere. You are drastically impacting the environment. For instance, the plastic rate in the ocean dropped, but it was actually the plastic bottles were replaced by face masks. So we were still polluting the environment, and we were still polluting the oceans, but with different items that we were drastically using. And to me, that comes in down to saying that we are just not catered and not cultured to take care of the environment. And we need to do a lot about the education side of this. And I think that is something I hope that environmentalists have managed to realize, because I think we can put our energy into it.
Thanks a lot, Pegah. As I'm also giving the floor also to other speakers, but there are two questions that I would like to share with you that are around in the chat, so you can answer them as well. And it's how COVID is affecting two aspects of life. One is how is it affecting armed conflicts, that on the one side, and the other, how is it affecting healthcare for young people, especially for vulnerable groups? I'm looking at Rory, Aggie, Pegah, Gregg, if anyone wants to continue answering or to try to answer these two questions.
I think it's difficult to answer because, but to contribute to any of that, and sorry for going back to the previous one. It's very, very quick. So as soon as I sink into one of the questions, then so sorry, just bear with me. So about what you were sharing, Pegah, this caring for the environment, and like I said, in this project now, in the past months during the pandemic, we work with a group of people really focusing on this, really where this shift is coming from inside of us, and how can we nurture our commitment to change the way we live. And what we had as a red thread throughout this course was something like a change in the narrative from this way of the paradigm of separated egos, or separated groups of people or individuals. So this story of separation into a very different story. And we looked at that in the workshop in the morning. Sorry, my daughter is really needing my attention, knocking on the window. So yeah, basically I just want to say that I think it's a more fundamental, really you can take it as a philosophical question, but in a way that is really reflected in each one of us individual lives when it comes to daily decisions. And this is do I see myself as a separated individual, separated from other individuals and other sides of society, and separated from nature? Or is it an interconnectedness? Do I see myself as part of a system in any different ways? So to me, this is really a fundamental question of inner shift. And we try to support people in this inner shift that can then result in outer action. So maybe a deeper inspiration for really thinking about my way of using resources, transport, where I shop, where I attend a school, whether that decision is influenced by use of car or not. So it's just it's really related to everything. And I believe that first is this inner shift of really understanding that I'm part of it and not just someone separately, like trying to protect something that is out there. Yeah, so just
Thanks a
going
lot,
back.
Aggie. Feel free to bring your daughter with us, so we can share. We can share the space as well. I would say that it's difficult to change the world if we don't change ourselves. I don't know if there is any answer or any comment on this. I guess it's hard to get an answer, but or a comment on how COVID is changing or maybe affecting armed conflicts and healthcare. Not the
Well,
answer,
this is great.
can-
Very briefly, we know that ceasefires have been declared in some parts of the world. Yemen, is an example, where the parties in conflict said that they would take a ceasefire during the pandemic. So I think it has had an impact, just as it's in the short term. The violence in different parts of the world between armed groups has gone down. But again, one imagines that might only be temporary. And so how do you take advantage of the opportunity to make the peace more enduring? I don't know the answer to that, but we do know that the pandemic should be hopefully viewed as a global problem that really requires the contributions of all peoples, of all countries. And can countries look beyond self-interest and sovereignty, if you will, to recognize that public health issues are impacting all of us? And I don't know the answer to that. That's where you would hope that leadership, both informal and formal, would step forward and provide the kind of behavior that we like to see on the global scale. So, but for the time being, there has been a dip in armed conflict, and we can be grateful for that. We just hope it could be long term.
Thanks, Gregg. Pegah, yeah, if you wanted to add something.
Yes, I'm thinking of answering the two questions together because I know there's one on mental health and one on how it's impacting armed conflict. So I'll try to answer both. I'll start with the first one, which Gregg kindly started the contribution towards, so my mind is on it. I think I remember I read an article which ISIS declared itself, since we're going through a pandemic, we're going to stop our operations. And I remember how people found it hilarious that even ISIS cares about a pandemic, and then President Trump doesn't. So that was for me one reflection that okay, it is pausing, but the story of Yemen shows us what happens if there is a pandemic and an armed conflict. What is the relationship? And what we see here is that there is a catastrophe happening. That the organizations that are operating in peace building in Yemen, they are like, God, I don't know what to focus on. There is a food issue, there is an armed conflict, and there is a pandemic that is basically just killing people off. And what happens here is that we see a thinning of resources. They don't know what to focus on. They focus a bit on this, a bit on that, and at the same time, you rescue very little people. And what we see the impact here is that this is drastically impacting the process of peace building because you also have other things to focus on. And as a result, I think for us, Yemen is a very good story to say that a pandemic should not be mixed with an armed conflict. And what we see here is that it's only going to get worse. And as peace builders, we really need to make sure that we do as much as we can for activities that are going on in Yemen, because I don't think it can get any worse than that. It's the worst combination of everything. So there's that. When it comes to mental health issues, I think it's a brilliant topic. And what I've noticed, and as someone who's been an advocate on mental health issues since I was 15, I've noticed that people are understanding mental health issues way better because they know that it can happen to anyone and it can happen in any situation. And because everybody's in a lockdown, at some point, your life just becomes overwhelming. You're constantly in front of a screen, your meetings in front of a screen, you don't really interact with others, you miss that family touch. And as a result, you realize that, okay, I thought I was bulletproof when it comes to mental health issues, but it's always there. But what we've also noticed is that how certain countries are extremely cut when it comes to mental health resources. some local authorities rarely have the funding to actually provide support. So, for instance, we've had Prince William taking, these humanitarian calls because we are understaffed when it comes to providing mental health support online and virtually. So this is a point of reflection to say that we are not doing enough. And I think what we can learn from ourselves is that we are always a step away from having a mental health. And we need to have that understanding and taking care of ourselves.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Loro, sorry.
No, that's it. I'm done.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Pegah. I have a lot of requests for the floor, and I would like to at least to try to finish this on time. As afterwards we have the youth, we have the Peace Cafe, and we could take a little break before. Look, what I'm gonna propose you is that I'm gonna mention the people who has questions, and I'm gonna give the floor for 30 seconds to each of you, so we can have a last round of questions, and then the panel can answer them as they feel. Please go to the point, so we can have time to take all the questions. And I would start with Anastasia.
Yep, thank you so very much. I will be as brief as possible. My question is, what role is environmental security currently playing in integration of the minorities, like in integration of the refugees and migrant community? What role maybe it has been playing before pandemic? Obviously, it's changed now. And what is your vision to how it should change now, since it has been explicitly shown that we are all interconnected and that we are in this together?
Thanks a lot, Anastasia. Then next on my list, I had Mariam.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your informative and interesting presentations. I will try to make a brief question. So at the beginning of the webinar, we mentioned that the COVID-19 situation created many challenges and opportunities on the other hand. But thanks to the information and communications technology, we could do many things from the pandemic situation to today. So I would like to hear from you, how can you just make connection between technology and sustainability, or how can the technology or artificial intelligence apply to sustainability? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mariam. I guess that the panel will have a hard time to answer these really deep and interesting questions. And lastly, I would like to give the floor to Soso for a last question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for interesting presentations and interesting question answer round. So my question would be to kind of to remember what Julia said and to like follow up from there. So since we saw this selfishness and us caring about forgetting about others basically, and caring about such things as us not having toilet papers when others do not have simple food supply or soap simply to protect themselves, and also to remember that we kind of forgot about some existence of some conflicts which maybe have not been posed, or the ones which got posed transformed more into like advanced fight for resources instead of just becoming peaceful. All the selfishness and forgetfulness of, if I can say this word, forgetfulness of other conflicts. How do you think these have changed our view on human rights, and or how these will change our view when this thing is finally over?
Also, thanks a lot for your question. So I know it's a hard task for the panel, because these three questions are really deep and with consequences. I don't know who would like to start. From you.
I'm happy to chip in if that's all right.
Oh, Rory, thanks a lot for being the first one.
Yeah, I feel like it's a dangerous thing to volunteer myself. Yeah, I think Sosa's question is very related to Igor's question about sort of the vulnerabilities that we already had in our supply systems and things like that. When we look at how fragile an infrastructure we have in the world when it comes to even diplomacy, but also in particular resources and trading and things like that. I mean, it only took a pandemic for us to fight over really small things that weren't so important at all, and actually the bigger issues weren't really being discussed until now, until a few months later. I don't think I have much optimism that will get better unless we proactively, make an effort to actually be a bit more understanding and share the resources that we have. But being a bit of a pessimist, I don't know if it's realism or pessimism. I think, the more that if we don't learn from this, for example, to start with, if we don't learn from this, I think we can expect to see conflict over resources and our weak infrastructure increase. That's already happening within countries. I mean, in the UK, there are still discussions about where supplies are going, and we thought that we had a good infrastructure for resources and supplies in the UK, but we obviously didn't. And when it comes to sort of cooperating with other countries in Europe, we haven't had the cooperation that we should have had. We do have the infrastructure for cooperation. It's weak and it's not the best in the world, but there is infrastructure there and it's not really been used. And only until now are we sort of opening up and trying to find solutions together. So yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I think that's also where we come in. We should be demanding better. We should be expecting much better, and we should definitely call out governments, if you can, call out a government when they're not sort of doing what they should be doing, which is sort of working with their partners, working within the community, but also working with other countries to make sure that we aren't sort of isolating ourselves, but isolating other people. Without that, I think we can probably expect to see more conflicts over resources. And then add on top of that the environment and the degradation of our environment and the sort of increased vulnerability of resources that come from that. And yeah, I think it just needs a constant reminder that this is a constant reminder that we need to proactively ask for better and demand better and come up with solutions where we can and put those forward. But yeah, sorry if that bummed you out. It's a bit of a Debbie Downer answer.
Thanks a lot, Rory. I'm looking at the panel. I would invite you as well, if you want, as you answer the question, maybe to try to wrap up with some conclusions to the meeting. I'm seeing the panel, and I see that Pegah wants to go next.
Yes, I'll be very, very, very brief. I just wanted to answer Mariam's question with respect to refugees. Unfortunately, I don't know that much about minorities on this because it's not my focus. I'm more focused on or specialized in refugee rights. And so far, by speaking with a special representative on migration and refugees and also UNHCR, they have specifically said that member states of UN and Council of Europe have basically postponed decisions on applications of refugees until further notice. And what that potentially means is that schemes such as family reunification, impossible to process. There is also young refugees, specifically who are still in camps to this day, and their applications basically postponed. And what that issue is that there is a huge or limited access to their human rights, as they have limited resources, but also their the standard of living is very low. So at the moment, COVID-19 is drastically impacting, let's say, refugees and their access to rights, just because it's just paused every progress that was being made, and now member states have an excuse to say, but we're dealing with COVID, what do you want us to do? So yeah, that's something we are trying to tackle on an institutional level.
Thanks a lot, Pegah.
Yeah, so just for the kind of last word, I don't think I have any of the answers. For myself, I see that we are more focusing here on like the global picture. And I just want to encourage ourselves to also think personally and locally. So like, what are these global functions from food security or anything, or childcare, that we can organize for ourselves? So yeah, like growing food locally. And I know it will now sound a bit like naive, But most mindjárt. Yes. So I really guess that for me, what is the one of the big ahas of the whole pandemic is to really focus more on local connections and local society and local, like, people in my neighborhood, people who live next door, who I can share. Like I bought 5 chickens because finally I was staying home for long enough to take care of my chickens. But now if I want to go out, I need people to come into my place and look after my chickens. So these are like win-win situations. And I think we really need to start thinking, in close links and close loops and close connections again. Yes. So that's.
Thanks a lot, Aggie.
Thank you.
Gregg, I'm giving you the floor for final answer and for some final words from you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for including me in this conversation. I appreciate everyone's contributions. I'll offset Rory a bit by saying I still remain optimistic. And I think if there's one thing that this whole pandemic has taught me and my students is the importance of seeing connections. And we can't separate climate change from public health. We can't separate human rights from the climate refugees and migration. I mean, and if anything, we can encourage our neighbors, our students, ourselves to be more holistic and systems thinkers and understand that in those connections there are opportunities for positive social change. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gregg, and thanks a lot, Aggie, Pegah, and Rory for having joined Youth Peace Week and for being a part of Youth Peace Week. I would just highlight the last words on the importance of connections, and I would say that maybe it's time for making this motto, like, think global but act local, to make it real and okay, think global and finally truly act locally, because maybe locally it's where the answers to challenges start. I thank you a lot for this. Just let me share with you the link for the evaluation. It's the same link every day, but still let me share it with you in the chat. Here it is. And just to remind you that in 25 minutes, so at 6, in this same room, we will be having Peace Cafe, which will be a space for participants, but also for facilitators that you have been meeting these days, and for the team of trainers to be sharing about peace stories, and that actually this sharing space for peace stories and for peace experiences will continue tomorrow as well during the webinars. So thanks a lot, and I hope I will see some of you in 25 minutes. And again, for panelists, thanks a lot for being here.
Ramon, can I just take a floor for a second?
Of course, Agatha.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that I am going to announce and open the day 4 of the e-learning, this time on the human rights and health. So after all these days of discussion and challenges and inspirations, feel free to have a look what is there and how you can further explore the topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. For people.